Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today because you're in for a story that will literally glue you to the screen. Today we're going to take a look together at one of the most terrifying and mysterious criminal cases in the American South, the case of Carlton Gary, the man who terrorized an entire city and went down in history as the stalking Strangler. Imagine the quiet town of Columbus, Georgia in the late 1970s. A place where everyone knew everyone, where people left their windows open and trusted their neighbors. But that very idyll turned into a nightmare in a matter of months. Between February of '78 and September of that year, a series of brutal murders of elderly women took place here, shaking not only the local community, but all of America. Carlton Gary chose his victims carefully. They were lonely seniors living in quiet neighborhoods, women who felt safe in their own homes. His modus operandi was always the same and frighteningly personal. He used stalkings as a weapon, breaking in at night and leaving behind a trail of horror that investigators struggled to piece together. Today, we'll take a look together at who Carlton Gary really was, how he managed to elude justice for so long, and most importantly, how investigators finally unraveled this dark mystery. Get ready for a story full of twists and turns, forensic evidence, and questions that still have no clear-cut answers. So get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive into the Carlton Gary case. Carlton Michael Gary was born on the 14th day of December in the year 1950 in a small town in Georgia. His childhood was not an easy one, and as it later turned out, it may have been those early years that shaped who he later became. He grew up in a poor African-American family where stability and firm parental authority were lacking. His father was often away from home, and his mother struggled to support several children on her own. Carlton grew up in an environment where violence and crime were a normal part of everyday life. Even as a young boy, he exhibited problem behavior. He had frequent conflicts at school with his classmates and teachers, exhibiting anger and an inability to control his impulses. Psychologists who later commented on his case pointed out that Gary had developed behavioral patterns at an early age that set him apart from other children. He was not just a troubled student. He was a boy who was fascinated by violence and seemed to be drawn to it. At the age of 16, in the year 1966, Carlton Gary committed his first recorded crime. This was no petty shoplifting. It was a robbery. He and a group of other young men attacked an elderly man in the street and stole his wallet. This incident may have only ended in probation, but it was the beginning of a long criminal career.
What is interesting and what I would like to point out is the choice of the victim. Even back then, Gary was choosing older, more vulnerable people. 2 years later, at 18, Carlton Gary was first incarcerated. This time, it was a series of home invasions where he stole jewelry, money, and valuables. But even here, his specific pattern was evident. He broke mainly into the homes of elderly people who lived alone. Some witnesses from that time later testified that Gary had a special ability to recognize who was alone and vulnerable, like he had a sixth sense for these things. In the year 1970, at the age of 20, he was convicted of armed robbery. Along with an accomplice, he robbed an elderly woman in her home, threatened her with a gun, and stole all the valuables he could find. The woman survived but was traumatized. This crime earned him a sentence of 3 years in New York State prison, where he was detained at the time. Being in prison did not change Carlton Gary. Quite the opposite. Prison psychologists report that he became even more withdrawn and aggressive. He had frequent conflicts with other inmates and guards. Interestingly, it was during this time behind bars that Gary began to exhibit specific behaviors toward women, specifically older women who worked as prison staff. He was verbally aggressive towards them, using sexually motivated slurs and threatening them. After his release in 1973, Carlton Gary moved back to Georgia. For the next several years, he lived a relatively low-key life, at least on the outside. He worked odd jobs for a living, but never lasted long at anything. Neighbors described him as a quiet, withdrawn man who went out most nights and rarely spoke to anyone. In the year 1975, he was arrested again, this time for attempted rape. The victim was a 65-year-old woman whom he attacked in her home late one night. The woman was able to defend herself and Gary fled, but left behind evidence that led to his arrest. He received a suspended sentence and mandatory psychological treatment, which he never properly completed. The psychological profile that was developed during his stay in the treatment center showed a man with antisocial tendencies, incapable of empathy, and with a marked aggression directed at older women. Experts warned at the time that Gary posed a serious danger to society, especially to elderly and lonely women. Unfortunately, these warnings were not taken seriously enough. By the year 1977, Carlton Gary already had an impressive criminal history. He was a repeat offender with a specific pattern of behavior. He always chose older, lonely victims, often women, and his attacks became increasingly brutal. He was a man who knew how to remain stealthy, how to pick his victims, and how to exploit their vulnerability. And it was this combination of skill and pathology that made him one of the most dangerous predators of his time. Now we come to the hardest part of the story, the specific murders that rocked the city of Columbus. Brace yourselves, because what you're about to hear is truly horrifying. It all began on September 11th, the year 1977. The victim's name was Gertrude Miller, and she was attacked in her home. The attacker got to her in the night hours while she was sleeping. Gertrude was raped, and stockings with knotted ends were found at the scene. Crucially, Gertrude survived the attack. She was one of the few women to survive an encounter with this predator. She later recognized her attacker and identified him in court. Just 5 days later, on September 16, 1977, came the first murder. Fern Jackson, a 60-year-old woman living in the elegant Winton neighborhood, was found dead in her home. She had been raped, brutally beaten, and strangled with a nylon stocking. Her body was discovered the next day by neighbors who noticed that Fern had not gone out for her usual morning walk. Police found signs of forced entry at the scene. A window at the back of the house had been pried open. 8 days later, on September 24th, he struck again. Jean Diamondstein, a 71-year-old widow, was the next victim. Also living alone in a house in Winton, she too was raped and strangled with a stocking. Jean was found in her bedroom, partially covered by a sheet. The police were beginning to suspect they were dealing with a serial killer, but did not yet have enough evidence to link the cases. On the 21st of October in the year 1977, perhaps the most brutal murder in the series occurred. Florence Scheibel, an 89-year-old woman who was also virtually blind, was raped, beaten, and strangled with a stocking in her home. Florence was defenseless and completely dependent on her family. Her son and daughter-in-law found her dead when they came for a regular visit. Florence's body lay on the living room floor. Imagine the horror. An elderly, blind woman who could neither escape nor defend herself effectively. Her murder shocked the whole town. Just 4 days later, on October 25th, Marcia Sermond was found. She too had been sexually assaulted and strangled with a stocking. Her body had been carefully covered. Pillows, blankets, and sheets had been thrown over her, as if the perpetrator was trying to cover up his act, or perhaps felt some form of strange respect for the victim. Martha lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Winton, and her body was not discovered for several days. On December 28th, just after Christmas, when most people were spending time with their families, the perpetrator struck again.
Kathleen Woodruff, a 74-year-old woman, was raped and strangled, this time not with a stocking, but with a scarf. Her partially covered body lay on the bed. Kathleen was an active member of the local community, and her death caused another wave of panic. People stopped believing they were safe in their homes. Kathleen's murder was followed by a brief pause. The town hoped the nightmare was over. But on February 11, 1978, another attack occurred. Ruth Schwab was attacked in her home and found sitting on the edge of her bed with a stocking wrapped around her neck. Ruth survived this attack, but was in shock and unable to clearly identify her attacker. Sadly, Ruth died before the perpetrator was brought to justice. The next day, February 12th, Mildred Borum, an 88-year-old woman, was found. She was lying on her back in the hallway of her house with her face covered. She had been raped and strangled, this time not with a stocking but with a blind cord. Mildred lived alone, and her body was discovered by a mail carrier who noticed mail piling up in her mailbox. On April 19, 1978, the last known murder in the series occurred. Janet Kofer, a woman of 61, was raped and strangled with a stocking. Her body was lying in bed, covered by bedclothes with a pillow over her face. Janet was found by her daughter, who came to visit. In less than 8 months, 7 women were murdered, and at least 2 others survived brutal attacks. All the victims were elderly women living alone in relatively affluent neighborhoods. All were attacked at night in their own homes, the places where they should feel safest. Now let's look at what makes this case so frightening from a forensic point of view, the exact way the perpetrator worked. His modus operandi was so specific that investigators were able to piece the cases together. Let's start with how the perpetrator chose his targets. It wasn't a random selection. It was a carefully planned strategy. He moved through neighborhoods during the day, watching houses, observing who came and went. He noticed which houses had only one car parked out front, which gardens were meticulously maintained by one person's hands, which houses had only one room with a light on in the evening. He was a silent observer, taking mental notes on his potential victims. Neighbors later testified that they saw an unknown man walking around the neighborhood, but it never aroused their suspicions. He looked like someone just passing by. When he chose his target, he waited for the right moment. He never attacked right away. He might watch one house for days, maybe even weeks, until he was absolutely sure of his victim's routine. He knew when the woman went to bed, when she turned out the lights, whether she had any regular visitors. This planning phase shows a high degree of self-control and the ability to delay gratification, qualities not usually seen in disorganized serial killers. The actual home invasions were always carried out in the same way. The perpetrator preferred the back entrance or windows at the rear of the house where he could not be seen from the street. He used simple tools, a screwdriver, a small crowbar, sometimes just bare strength was enough. He picked window or door locks with surprising ease, which indicated that he was experienced in this type of activity. What's fascinating, he never broke the glass. He never broke a single pane. Why is that? Because the noise could wake the victim prematurely or alert the neighbors. He was incredibly careful, almost like a professional thief. Once inside, he acted like a ghost. He moved around the house quietly, often barefoot to minimize sound. The forensics team found barefoot prints at some of the crime scenes. First, they checked out the house, got an idea of the floor plan, found the victim's bedroom. Sometimes he spent a few minutes inside the house just observing before he attacked.
In some cases, evidence was found of him searching drawers and closets before he approached the victim. The attack itself was always sudden and brutal. He approached the bed of a sleeping woman and immediately physically overpowered her. He used his weight and strength to pin her to the bed. His hands were strong. He could hold his victim still with one hand while reaching for what became his signature tool with the other. And now we come to the stalking. The stalkings were always there. Either he found them in the victim's house, in the underwear drawers, or he brought them with him. Forensic analysis showed that some of the stalkings came from the victim's homes, others were foreign. This means that he sometimes planned the attack to the extent of bringing his own tool. He used the stalkings in several ways. Sometimes he pulled them over the victim's head as an improvised mask or bag, causing panic and lack of oxygen. Other times he wrapped them around his neck like a noose and tightened them until the victim lost consciousness or died. The force he used to strangle them was enormous. Forensic pathologists found deep stalking marks on the victims' bodies, broken cartilage in the neck, damage to the larynx. Sometimes he tightened the stocking so tightly that the material cut several millimeters into the skin. The strangulation was not quick. It lasted several minutes, during which the victim suffered and fought for his life. The physical assault was followed by sexual violence. The details are gruesome, but it is important to mention them to understand the psychology of the perpetrator. The violence was aggressive and humiliating. The perpetrator showed no empathy or humanity. The victims were left in humiliating positions, their clothes torn or completely removed.
In some cases, traces of brutal physical violence were found in intimate areas. What is psychologically interesting is that the crime was followed by a ritual. The perpetrator covered the bodies of his victims. He used sheets, blankets, pillows, sometimes clothes. The bodies were carefully covered, often with their faces. This act of covering has a specific meaning in criminal psychology. It may indicate guilt, discomfort with what he has done, or conversely, some perverse form of respect for the victim. Some profilers have interpreted this behavior as a sign of internal conflict. Part of the perpetrator may have regretted his actions, but was not strong enough to stop him. Even more frightening is the fact that he sometimes stayed at the crime scene after the murder. He ate food from the victim's fridge, drank their drinks, used their bathrooms. In one case, traces were found of him lighting a cigarette and smoking it in the living room while the dead body lay in the bedroom. This ice-cold coldness shows a complete lack of empathy. When he left the scene, he was again extremely cautious. He wiped the doorknobs, erased his fingerprints, sometimes took small valuables, jewelry, money, trinkets. But the main motive was not theft. The valuables were more like trophies, souvenirs of his exploits. He would leave the same way he came in, out the back door or window, leaving behind a dead wife and a devastated family. Now we're going to look at how investigators approached this case and how they tried to get on the perpetrator's trail. I have to say that what you're about to hear shows both the genius of forensic science and the limits of the investigative methods of the time. The Columbus police initially faced a huge problem. They didn't want to cause a panic. When the first incidents happened, the local department tried to handle them as isolated cases. No one wanted to admit that a serial killer might be operating in the city. But the forensic evidence began to speak volumes. Comparative analyses of footprints from all the crime scenes showed disturbing similarities. The method of entry, the type of weapon used, the sexual motivations, the ages and profiles of the victims. It all screamed in one voice: we have a serial killer. The head of the investigation, Sheriff Jim Wetherington, convened a special task force. They brought in detectives from surrounding counties, forensic specialists, and even psychologists. They set up an operations center where they began mapping all the cases on a large bulletin board. Each victim had its own section with crime scene photos, witness statements, and forensic findings.
When you looked at the bulletin board, the pattern was clear, but the identity of the perpetrator remained a mystery. A forensics team led by Dr. Joseph Weber began working on analyzing the biological traces. The problem was that in the 1970s there was no DNA analysis as we know it today. They worked with what they had: blood types, hair, fibers. They found dark hair at several crime scenes that didn't belong to the victims. Analysis showed it came from an African-American male. They also found semen samples from which they were able to determine the offender's blood type, type O, which approximately 45% of the population had. It wasn't very specific, but it was a start. What was frustrating for the investigators were the fingerprints, or rather the lack of them. The perpetrator was extremely cautious. They found no usable prints at most crime scenes. Where they did find some, they were smudged or partial, useless for identification. This suggested he was either wearing gloves or wiping carefully. A key moment in the investigation was the survivor's testimony. I can't name specific names because of the sensitivity of the case, but this woman was able to provide the first real description of the attacker. She told investigators that he was an African-American male, approximately 180 centimeters tall, athletic build, with short hair. She described his voice as deep and calm, which was frightening. Even during the attack, he spoke in a controlled, emotionless manner. She also mentioned that he had strong hands and moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Based on this statement, the police created a drawing. The portrait was distributed throughout the city, published in newspapers and posted in public places. Citizens were asked to report anyone who matched the description. The tip line was flooded with calls. Hundreds of people called in with suspicions, accusing neighbors, ex-partners, anyone who looked suspicious to them. Investigators had to go through every single tip, which was incredibly time-consuming. Another important part of the investigation was the geographic profile analysis. Detectives noticed that all the attacks were concentrated in a certain area, the Winton area and adjacent locations. They created a map with the locations of the crimes marked and began to study the pattern. They saw that the perpetrator moved in a relatively small radius, indicating that he either lived or worked in the area. He had an intimate knowledge of the terrain, knew which streets were deserted at night, where there were no streetlights, which were quick to escape. That's where the FBI comes in. The local police asked for help from federal agents, specifically the Behavioral Analysis Unit, a famous unit that specializes in profiling serial offenders. Special Agent Robert Ressler, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling. Ressler spent days studying cases, visiting crime scenes, talking to investigators. The profile Ressler created was fascinating. He said they were looking for men between the ages of 25 and 35, probably with criminal histories involving sex offenses or violence. He'll be someone who lives alone or with his mother, probably unemployed or working part-time, which gives him time to pursue victims. He will be intelligent but socially isolated, with difficulty establishing normal relationships with women his own age. Ressler also predicted that the perpetrator has a specific resentment toward older women, perhaps due to some childhood trauma associated with his mother or another female authority figure. What was brilliant about Ressler's profile was the explanation of the ritual of covering the bodies. He said it was not an act of contrition, but rather a way for the perpetrator to maintain the illusion of control and respectability. It's a paradox. Someone who commits such brutal acts but then feels uncomfortable looking at the result of their work. Investigators also coordinated with police departments in neighboring cities and states. They sent inquiries to see if they had similar unsolved cases. Interesting connections emerged. There were cases in New York and South Carolina with a similar modus operandi, but the connections didn't happen quickly enough. Another line of investigation was the analysis of stolen items. The perpetrator was taking jewelry and small valuables. Detectives began monitoring pawn shops and second-hand stores in hopes that the perpetrator would try to sell his trophies. They distributed lists of stolen items to every pawnbroker within a 100-mile radius. A few items did turn up, but the trail led to dead ends. The pressure on the police was enormous. The media covered the case daily. The townspeople lived in fear. Elderly women were afraid to stay home alone. Sales of security locks and alarms skyrocketed. The community held meetings where the police advised citizens how to protect themselves. They advised the elderly to leave keys with neighbors, install better lighting, don't communicate with strangers. The investigation team worked day and night. They had a list of suspects, men with criminal histories in the area who fit the profile. They had to vet each one, check their alibis for the dates of the attacks. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And yet they knew the perp was out there, maybe stalking another victim. After years of investigation, a breakthrough came that no one expected. And I have to say, the way Carlton Gary came into the hands of the police was almost ironic. It wasn't the result of some grand police operation or brilliant detective judgment. It was a simple coincidence linked to the theft of a gun. On May 3, 1984, 6 years after the last murder, Carlton Gary came into the police's sights for a very different reason. Detectives in South Carolina were investigating a series of armed robberies of restaurants that earned him the nickname Steakhouse Bandit. Gary was arrested in connection with these robberies, and a gun was found on him during a search.
When they routinely ran the serial number of the gun, they discovered something fascinating. The gun had been reported stolen in a burglary in Columbus, Georgia, in the year 1977. And it wasn't just any burglary. It was a burglary in the Winton area, right where the stalking Strangler operated. This is where the detectives raised their heads. They had a man carrying a gun stolen from the area where the horrible murders were taking place, at the exact time the murders were taking place. It couldn't have been a coincidence. They immediately contacted the Columbus police and shared information about Gary's arrest. Investigators in Columbus began working feverishly. They pulled Gary's criminal file and began studying it. When they saw his history, violence against older women, sex offenses, burglaries, it all fit together like a puzzle. Then came the crucial step. They asked authorities in South Carolina for Gary's fingerprints. They had them in their database from his previous arrests. When the prints arrived in Columbus, the forensics team began the most important work of their careers. They took Gary's prints and started comparing them to latent prints they found at murder scenes from the 70s. And then came the electrifying moment, the match. Not just one crime scene, not two, but 4 different crime scenes. Gary's fingerprints matched the prints found on items in the homes of the murdered women. Imagine the atmosphere at the police station. After years of frustration, after hundreds of dead ends, suddenly they had physical evidence linking a specific man to 4 murders. Detective Mike Sellers, who led the renewed investigation, later said it was one of the most powerful moments of his career. They immediately issued a warrant for Carlton Gary's arrest. Since he was already in custody in South Carolina, they coordinated his transfer to Georgia. On May 5th, he was formally charged with the Columbus murders and transported back to the city where he had caused so much suffering. The interrogation of Carlton Gary was both fascinating and frustrating. Detectives confronted him with evidence, fingerprints, a stolen gun, witness statements. Gary initially denied everything. He claimed he'd never been to Columbus, that he'd gotten the gun from someone else, that the prints must be a mistake. But investigators had too much evidence, and Gary knew it. After hours of questioning, Gary changed his strategy. Suddenly, he started talking. He admitted that he had been present at some of the Columbus burglaries. He said that yes, he had been in those houses. But then he came up with a story that would change everything. He accused someone else.
He claimed a man named Malvin Crittenden, sometimes called Michael Crittenden, committed the murders. According to Gary's version, he was just present, helping with the burglaries. But Crittenden was the one who did the killing. Detectives, of course, immediately began looking into Crittenden's name. They searched all the databases, looking for anyone with that name in the area. The result? Nothing. No Malvin or Michael Crittenden in any records. No one with that name was reported as a suspect, not listed in any criminal files from the time. Gary's story started to fall apart. Then came the next key part of the investigation. The detectives did something unusual. They took Gary for a ride around Columbus. They wanted to see how well he knew the city. And Gary shocked them. He drove them around the streets of Winton, pointing out houses. "This is where it happened," he said at one house. "And here," he pointed to another. He identified house after house, the exact ones where murders or attempted murders had occurred. The familiarity he displayed was frightening. He knew which houses had a back entrance, where the windows were, what the gardens looked like. This wasn't the knowledge of someone who had just happened to walk by. This was the intimate knowledge of someone who had studied these places carefully. When detectives analyzed his statement, they found inconsistencies. Gary said that Crittenden was murdering while he waited outside or in another room. But then he described details he couldn't have known unless he was directly present during the attacks. He knew how the victims were dressed, where their bodies lay in the house, what objects were used. This information was never made public. It was details that only the police and the perpetrator knew. The prosecution began to build a case. They had fingerprints from 4 crime scenes. They had a stolen gun from the area. They had Gary's own admission that he had been in the houses. They had his detailed knowledge of the crime scenes. And they had surviving witnesses that could identify Gary. Formal charges were filed in stages. First, he was charged with 3 murders, the ones where the fingerprints were clearest and the evidence strongest. Then, as the investigation continued and the prosecution gathered more evidence, more charges were added. In all, Carlton Gary was officially charged with 9 counts, 7 murders and 2 attempted murders. Each charge was documented in detail. The prosecution compiled files of photographs, forensic reports, witness statements. They knew this case would be watched by the entire country, and they had to be prepared for the most rigorous scrutiny. Gary was held without bail. He was considered extremely dangerous. Prison authorities placed him in a maximum security cell, isolated from other prisoners. The media went crazy. After 6 years, they finally had a suspect. Columbus could finally breathe. The Carlton Gary trial began in August of 1986 and became one of the most watched court cases in Georgia history. The courtroom in Muskogee County was packed. Relatives of the victims, reporters, curious citizens, all wanting to see the man who terrorized their town nearly a decade ago. The lead prosecutor was William Smith, an experienced prosecutor who knew this case would define his career. On the other side were Gary's defense attorneys, who had the extremely difficult task of defending a man against whom hundreds of pieces of evidence had been amassed. The defense was led by attorney Bert Blalock, who adopted a strategy of questioning the quality of the forensic evidence and pointing out procedural errors in the investigation. The trial began with jury selection, which itself took several days. Both sides carefully selected jurors who would be able to judge the case impartially, even though all of Columbus had been talking about the murders for years. In the end, a jury of 12 people was selected, men and women of different ages and backgrounds. The prosecutor's opening statement was powerful and emotional. Smith described each victim by name, showing photographs of them from when they were alive. He spoke of their lives, their families, and how they were brutally murdered in their own homes. Then he turned to the evidence, the fingerprints, the testimonies, the stolen items. His message was clear. Carlton Gary is the man who caused all this pain. The defense argued in its opening statement that the evidence was purely circumstantial. Blalock argued that fingerprints may be in place for a number of reasons, that Gary may have been in the houses, but that doesn't automatically mean he did the killing. He reminded the jury that there is a presumption of innocence in America, and that the burden of proof is on the state. The first witnesses called by the prosecution were relatives of the victims. Daughters, sons, grandchildren. All testified about what their mothers and grandmothers were like, how they were found dead, how it changed their lives forever. These testimonies were overwhelmingly emotional. Many people in the courtroom cried, including some of the jurors. Then the forensic experts came forward. Dr. Joseph Weber, the chief forensic pathologist, described in detail the injuries on the victims' bodies. He showed photographs that were so gruesome that the judge had to repeatedly point out to those present the graphic nature of the images. Weber explained how the deaths occurred, what force was used, how long the victims suffered. His testimony was scientific, but also deeply disturbing. A key moment in the trial was the testimony of the fingerprint expert. He presented the jury with enlarged photographs of prints found at the crime scenes and Gary's prints from the police record. Point by point, line by line, he showed the matches. He explained that the likelihood of two people having identical prints was virtually nil.
They had matches on at least 12 characteristic points on each print, far exceeding the standard needed for identification. The defense sought to cast doubt on this evidence. They brought in their own expert, who claimed that some of the prints were too blurry or partial to make a 100% identification. But their expert was not as persuasive as the state's expert, and admitted under cross-examination that the matches were indeed there. Another crucial part of the trial was the testimony of the survivors. These women had to relive their trauma in front of a packed courtroom. They described how they woke up with a strange man in their bedroom, how he attacked them, how they fought for their lives. One of them, looking directly into Gary's eyes, said, "That's him. I recognize his face. I recognize his voice. This is the man who tried to kill me." It was an incredibly powerful testimony. The defense tried to attack the reliability of these identifications. They argued that the memories years later may be distorted, that the women had seen Gary's photo in the media and it had affected their memories. But the witnesses were firm and consistent in their testimony. The prosecution also presented evidence of stolen property. Some of the jewelry and items stolen from the victims' homes were found in Gary's possession or were sold at the pawn shop where Gary brought them. Pawn shop owners identified Gary as the man who sold the items. When it was the defense's turn, the defense chose not to put Gary on the stand. This was a risky decision, but defense attorneys knew that under cross-examination Gary could do more harm than good. Instead, they focused on questioning the timeline and pointing out the absence of DNA evidence, even though DNA analysis was not yet commonly used at the time. The closing arguments were dramatic. Prosecutor Smith summarized all the evidence, one by one, and painted an unquestionable picture of guilt. "Fingerprints don't lie," he said. "The surviving victims don't lie. The evidence doesn't lie. Carlton Gary is the stalking strangler, and it's time for him to pay for his actions." In his closing argument, defense attorney Blalock appealed to the jury's reason. He urged them not to get caught up in emotion, to carefully consider each piece of evidence. But it was clear he was in a difficult position. The jury retired to deliberate on the 26th day of August,
1986. Deliberations lasted less than 5 hours. When the jury returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. The foreman of the jury stood up and read the verdict. Guilty. Guilty of all 3 murders. Guilty of all 3 rapes. Guilty of all 3 burglaries. Carlton Gary showed no emotion. He sat motionless, as if it didn't concern him. But in the part of the courtroom where the victims' relatives sat, cries of relief could be heard. The next day, August 27th, the sentencing phase began.
The prosecution argued for the death penalty, pointing to the brutality of the crimes and the aggravating circumstances, that the murders were committed during a burglary and rape. They also presented evidence of Gary's prior convictions for violent crimes. The defense sought life in prison instead of the death penalty. They talked about Gary's difficult childhood, the lack of parental care, and the cycle of violence. But the jury wasn't convinced. After brief deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty for all 3 murders. The judge accepted their recommendation. Carlton Gary was sentenced to death 3 times, once for each murder. In addition, he received a life sentence for each rape and 20 years for each burglary, all sentences to run consecutively, that is, consecutively. When the judge pronounced the sentence, silence reigned in the courtroom. It was over. After nearly 10 years, the victims' families finally had justice. After the verdict, a long and complicated appeals process that lasted decades began. And I have to say, this part of the case shows just how complex and sometimes controversial the American justice system can be. Gary's legal team immediately filed an appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. Their first line of argument focused on the claim that the defense did not have adequate resources and time to prepare the case. They argued that given the seriousness of the charges and the amount of evidence, they needed more time to prepare, more funding for their own forensic experts, and better access to investigative materials. In the year 1990, the first big twist came. The Court of Appeal found something disturbing. The prosecution had withheld certain evidence from the defense during the original trial. Specifically, these were documents relating to one of the witnesses, who had a problematic past and whose credibility could be called into question. This violation of the Brady disclosure rule, the prosecutor's obligation to share all evidence with the defense, was considered a serious procedural error. Based on this finding, one of the death sentences was overturned. But be warned, this does not mean that Gary was found not guilty. It only means that the trial was not conducted fairly and justly. This precedent has opened the door to further appeals and further scrutiny of the case. In the year 1993, another revelation came. It became apparent that there was additional evidence that had not been presented to the defense during the investigation and trial. These were detectives' notes from interviews with other suspects who were considered possible perpetrators early in the investigation. Some of these notes contained information that could have created a reasonable doubt about Gary's guilt, or at least whether he acted alone. There were also questions about the manner in which fingerprints were obtained. A new team of forensic experts hired by the defense examined the original photographs of the prints and argued that the quality of some of the prints was too poor for reliable identification. They argued that the technology in the 1970s and 1980s was not as advanced as it is today, and that there may have been errors in the comparisons. In 1994, a federal court ordered a new hearing on the death penalty. The reason was incompetent legal representation during the sentencing phase of the original trial. The court found that defense counsel had not presented sufficient mitigating evidence, information about Gary's traumatic childhood, possible mental disorders, history of abuse. These factors may have influenced the jury's decision between the death penalty and life imprisonment. Then came the turning point that changed the entire case: DNA analysis. In 2006,
20 years after the original trial, Gary's legal team requested new testing of biological evidence using modern DNA technology. This technology simply didn't exist in the 1980s, but now it could provide definitive answers. The court allowed testing of samples that had been preserved from crime scenes. We're talking about semen samples, hair, blood stains, and biological material under the fingernails of some of the victims. These samples have been stored in police evidence rooms for years, waiting for the day when technology might reveal their secrets. The Dallas Gene Screen Lab was tasked with the analysis. Their work was painstaking and lengthy. Some samples were degraded due to poor storage or simple age, but for some samples, they were able to extract usable DNA. The results came back in the year 2007, and they were complicated. In one case, the murder of one of the victims, the DNA clearly matched Gary's profile. That was strong evidence confirming his guilt, at least in this particular case. But then came the surprise. In two other cases, the DNA in the semen samples didn't match Gary. Instead, it matched two different, unidentified men. This finding shook the whole case. How is it possible that the DNA at the crime scenes doesn't belong to the man who was convicted of these murders? The prosecution immediately offered an explanation. They argued that the DNA could have come from the victims' previous sexual contacts with their husbands or partners before their deaths. They argued that the absence of Gary's DNA did not mean he was innocent. After all, his fingerprints were found there. They also pointed out that there were no standard procedures for collecting and storing DNA evidence in the 1970s, so contamination may have occurred. The defense, on the other hand, argued that these results cast doubt on the entire case. They argued that if the DNA did not belong to Gary, he may not have been the perpetrator of these particular murders at all.
Perhaps his original theory about another man, even if the name Crittenden was made up, was not so far from the truth. Maybe he was actually present at the burglaries, but someone else was doing the killing. In the year 2009, there was further testing. This time they focused on the hair found at the crime scenes. Microscopic analysis of the hair showed that some of the hair morphologically matched Gary's hair, but modern mitochondrial DNA analysis failed to provide a definitive match. Mitochondrial DNA is not as specific as nuclear DNA. It is shared by all people in the maternal line, so it cannot positively identify an individual. A further complication was the discovery that some evidence was mislabeled or that the chain of custody was not properly documented. In several cases, it was unclear whether the sample that was tested in 2006 was actually the same sample that was collected at the crime scene in the 1970s. These procedural errors cast a further shadow on the reliability of the evidence. In 2010, Gary's lawyers made a massive filing in federal court arguing for the death penalty to be overturned, based on all this new information. Their document was over 300 pages long and included testimony from new experts, reanalyses of old evidence, and arguments about procedural errors. Interestingly, during this period, several of the original investigators came forward with their own doubts. One of the detectives who worked on the case, in 2012, stated that he always felt that Gary may not have acted alone. He said that some aspects of the crime suggested the work of multiple perpetrators, but this theory was never fully investigated because once they had Gary, the pressure to solve the case led to a focus on him alone. Organizations fighting the death penalty, such as the Innocence Project, began to look into the case. They pointed to it as an example of systemic problems in the American justice system: bias, incompetent legal representation, concealment of evidence, reliance on outdated forensic methods. Between 2010 and 2015,
A series of hearings and appeals took place. Each side presented new arguments, new experts, new interpretations of the evidence. The case became a textbook example of how difficult it can be to determine the truth even decades later. Carlton Gary died on March 15, 2018, at the age of 67, in the Georgia State Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson. His death was not natural. He was executed by lethal injection after spending more than 30 years on maximum security death row. It was the end of a long journey that began 40 years ago in Columbus. The last years of Gary's life in prison were marked by isolation and constant legal battles. He was placed in the most dangerous prisoner unit, where he spent 23 hours a day in a 3-by-2-foot cell. His daily routine was strictly regulated: an hour outside in a training area surrounded by high walls, limited visitors, controlled correspondence. Prison guards described him as a quiet, withdrawn man who kept his own diary and read religious books. He never publicly admitted guilt or expressed remorse for his actions. In the final months before his execution, Gary's legal team desperately sought a reprieve. They petitioned for clemency, asked for more DNA testing, argued for procedural errors. The Georgia Board of Parole unanimously denied his request for clemency. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to rehear the case. All avenues to rescue have been closed. On the day of his execution, Gary refused to say his last words. Lying on his bed in the execution chamber, hooked up to tubes of a lethal mixture of chemicals, he remained silent. He was pronounced dead at 10:33 that evening. Among the witnesses to the execution were relatives of the victims who had waited decades for this moment. The impact of Gary's case on the development of forensic genetics was enormous. His case became one of the first major trials to retrospectively use advanced DNA analysis to review old evidence. Forensic genetics laboratories have used his case as study material to teach about the limitations of DNA analysis on degraded samples. He also demonstrated the importance of proper storage of biological evidence. Many samples from his case were unusable due to mishandling in the 1970s and 1980s. Standards for handling biological material have changed dramatically thanks to cases like Gary's. Today, there are strict protocols for collecting, labeling, storing, and testing DNA evidence. The chain of custody is meticulously documented from crime scene to lab. Laboratories must be accredited and regularly inspected. All of these changes are rooted in past cases where deficiencies in evidence handling have led to legal challenges. For today's investigators, Gary's case has become a textbook example of how to avoid procedural errors and incomplete charges. Police academies use his case to teach the importance of transparency in investigations. Students learn about the need to share all evidence with the defense, the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, and how bias can affect the objectivity of a case. His case has also influenced the debate over the death penalty in America. Anti-death penalty organizations use him as an example of systemic problems: racial prejudice, poor legal representation for poor defendants, reliance on questionable forensic evidence. On the other hand, death penalty advocates point out that despite all the doubts and appeals, key evidence against Gary has remained unshakable. The impact on the Columbus community has been profound and long-lasting. Generations of residents grew up with a fear of the stalking strangler. For decades, older women in the city installed additional locks, security systems, and asked relatives for more frequent checks.
The culture of fear that Gary created persisted long after his arrest. It wasn't until his execution that many people felt a sense of final closure. Psychologists and criminologists study Gary's case as an example of a certain type of serial killer, an organized, methodical predator who carefully selects vulnerable victims. His ability to remain undetected for so long, his knowledge of forensic techniques, and his ability to manipulate the system during interrogations make him an interesting subject for behavioral analysis.
The legacy of his case is also reflected in legislative changes. Several states have adopted stricter rules for preserving evidence in cold cases. Special cold case units have been created that specialize in reviewing old unsolved homicides using modern technology. For the families of the victims, his death marked the final closure of a chapter that had affected their lives for 4 decades. Many of them died before they received justice. Those who lived to see the execution spoke of a sense of relief, but also that their pain would never completely go away. Ironically, Carlton Gary became part of criminal history not only as a perpetrator, but also as a catalyst for change in the American justice system. His case demonstrates both the strength and weaknesses of modern forensic science, and reminds us that the search for truth is often more complex than it first appears.